fundamental issues. The first one is the one that I would like to address, because it is the theme of this conference. The second one is in the field of economics, and the third in the field of policy, which we'll not go into here. This is the top curve, is the conventional global average temperature that has been become kind of folklore in the past decade or so. The bottom one shows the US record according to GIS, and it doesn't show a pronounced recent warming in the last part of the 20th century. I'll come back to that. Looking at the global record, what did I do wrong here?
You push the bottom button, push it again.
Okay. Where is the laser?
There should be a cylindrical laser up there, which is much better to use.
Show the laser.
This is laser? Oh. Go ahead. This warming here, I believe, is genuine. And this was brought out this morning by Peter Webster in his talk. I have great difficulty accepting the warming between 1978 and, let's say, 2000. And I'll explain why I have difficulty accepting that. And I hope I don't lose too many friends in this audience, because everyone has been using this. So let me quickly show 8 reasons why I do not wish to accept this warming. The satellites don't show the warming. The radio songs don't show the warming. Then there are 3 puzzles which can be solved by assuming that there's no warming, one by Santa, one by Lockwood, and one by Matt Wallace. The sea surface temperatures don't show warming, but that is complicated, and I may not have time to discuss all this. The ocean heat content shows no increase. And finally, the proxy data show no warming. Although we don't know what the hockey stick data shows, since they stopped in 1979, but if they're ever released, I'm fairly sure that they will also show no warming. So that is the problem as I see it, that the surface data are unique in that they show warming, but nobody else does. So let me quickly show the evidence. Most of you know it already. First, to indicate the importance of this, and follows the discussion by Judith Curry, the IPCC in the Summary for Policymakers makes a real point of this warming. It's very important to their final conclusion. But as their own figure shows, and this is here, they base it entirely on the difference between what they can account for by natural forcing and what they report as being observed. If this warming does not exist, this solves the problem for the IPCC. In other words, their conclusion will not be supported. The satellite data have analyzed the trends in this is the lower atmosphere. I've analyzed the trends. They show a slight negative trend, which becomes essentially 0 around 1997. And of course, because of the El Nino and this jump here, this is a pronounced jump, the trend becomes positive after 1998. But up to 1997, the trend is not positive. And if you account for the El Nino, you can say that the trend doesn't show a positive value up to about 2001. The balloon data similarly show no pronounced warming. Although much discussion about the balloon data, and perhaps the next speaker will have something to say about this. Now we come to the puzzles. The first puzzle is one paper by Santa in Science, 2005, with 24 co-authors. He studies the amplification in the tropical zone of the surface warming. This is well known theoretically, and of course every climate model shows this amplification, which is roughly a factor of 2. And what he shows in this panel is that the amplification is borne out by observations, provided the observations do not cover more than a few months. If the observations are multi-decadal, then there's a discrepancy between the observations and the models. And he terms this a puzzle. I think the puzzle can be easily solved if you assume that the surface trend is 0, because if you multiply 0 by a factor of 2, you get 0. The next puzzle is the one by Lockwood. I call it the solar paradox. Lockwood Froelich, published in the Proceedings of Our Society. Lockwood believes in solar effects on climate, but he says in the last 20 years there's something wrong here. There should be no solar effect on climate, yet he says there has been an observed rise in global mean temperatures. My comment is that if there's an absence of this rise, then this explains the paradox. The next puzzle is the one of the NASNRC report in 2000. Some of you may remember that. It was a panel headed by Mike Wallace, a very distinguished panel. They tried to reconcile observations of global temperature change, that is, they reconciled the disparity between surface and troposphere temperatures, and they couldn't reconcile it. Again, the simplest explanation would be to discard the reported surface. The panel, however, decided to disregard moisture event adjustment for upstream. Surprising. On SST, we published some results on that to show that the SST rise, the reported SST rise, is an artifact of the instrumentation of the observations. It's a different kind of artifact than the one discussed by Peter Webster, but the basic idea is similar. Changing instrumentations and combining different kinds of instrumentation can give you an artificial temperature rise. Just to show one result here, this shows the difference between ocean and land temperatures. And you see it's pretty much 0 all the way through. This is as measured by satellites. This is the lower troposphere. The artificial trend, in my view, is introduced by the introduction of buoys, particularly by surface buoys, by drifter buoys, which measure temperature at a level of around 25 to 50 centimeters, and therefore show a strong warming during the day. The normal, conventional way of measuring temperature is, of course, by inlet temperatures, which are at a level of about 5 to 10 meters, depending on the size of the ship, depending on the ship loading, and so on. Now, what happened is that the percentage of buoys increased from 0% in 1980 to 90% in 2010. So the buoys, which show a warmer ocean temperature, that will introduce an artificial trend. Here are some of the references for this. But as I say, we haven't tested these matters yet in these small this is just a sketch to show you where the drifter buoys are. They are in the surface zone, about 25 to 50 centimeters, and they are measure at much warmer temperatures than the engine inlet temperatures. And that is the problem. We've tried to look at this in a different point of view by looking at the strontium-calcium ratio in corals. So this is a well-known indicator of temperature. The data are not particularly good, but it's all you have. That but it's nice to have some confirmation. The ocean heat content may be the most important way of confirming what's happened to the sea surface temperature, but as you all know, unfortunately, the data on ocean heat content are not particularly good until you reach the 21st century and you have Argo buoys. But this is what was published, and you see that between 1979 and 1997, there is no pronounced warming. I don't take this cooling seriously, but at least it has no pronounced warming trend. We finally get to the proxies. This is the first one that I saw. This comes from 1996, and it sort of piqued my interest in this whole problem, because at the time the satellites were not showing the warming, and I'm a great believer in satellites. So this shows tree rings. It shows the warming from about 1850 to 1940. So it confirms the trend, the surface trend between 1910 and 40. After 1940, no warming. And then the next one I found were the ice cores of Dr. Jensen, and look particularly at, well, maybe panel B. It shows the recovery from the last ice age, the Holocene optimum, then the warming here, the medieval warming, and here's the medieval warming again. Here's the ice age. Here's the warming up to 1940. You can barely see it. And then it's like cooling. And she says, quite explicitly, there's no warming observed between 1940 and 1995 in the ice core record that she has published. This comes from Science, 1999. Here now I found more proxy data that show no warming in the last decades of the 20th century. Actually, these are, I didn't find them. These are from Frederick Lundqvist in Sweden, who sent them to me. He has about 40 examples, and perhaps he will publish this in the Journal of Climate. He didn't want to send out too many until his publication has been accepted. Finally, I'd like to look at the hockey stick. Most people have paid attention to the claim that the 20th century is the warmest in the last 1,000 years, and of course you know that this is no longer accepted, and that the hockey stick has been demolished, and that we have back to the conventional view that there was a medieval warming which is greater than the 20th century warming. But when this was first published in 1998, obviously I focused on the fact that you can see here that Michael Mann stops his record in 1978. So I emailed him and asked him what about the proxy data after 1978. And I got a very brusque reply. And since then I've been trying to find more proxy data. And I'm sure that I have a suspicion that the proxy data show no warming after 1979. So that Mike Mann stopped the hockey stick in 1979, and because he didn't want to disagree with Jones' zero temperature. I thought, this is just a suspicion. We won't know the answer until we can see the proxy data in the hockey stick record, and I hope that Michael Mann will eventually release his data so that we can know for sure. Now the question is, why is there no one? The conventional view has been that it's the urban heat island effect, and as you've just heard, the best result throws doubt on this. This is an old graph which shows the urban heat island effect in California. They have 107 stations, and you see that the stations in counties that have more than 1 million people show a strong warming and a higher temperature, and the stations in counties that have less than 100,000 people show very little warming trend and a lower temperature. What you may not remember, although it is published, is the fact that from these 107 stations, these 6 were selected for the U.S. record. And if you look at the selection, you'll see that all the selected stations showed a positive trend. In fact, these 3 showed the extreme positive trend. So the selection of station is important. Which stations were selected? Well, obviously, the people who did the selection wanted to have the best stations. Which are the best stations? Stations in airports. Stations that have a long, continuous, accurate record that are well kept and looked after. So our supposition was, and we need to straighten this out with the best people, that airports might be responsible for some of the reported warming. Let me show what happened, and I think you know this, to the number of weather stations in the historic network. They dropped from about 6,000 to 2,000 after 1970. The precipitous drop, this is published by NOAA, and then, a friend of Julian Leo, pointed out that at the same time when the stations dropped, the global temperatures rose precipitously. He's published that. So based on this, we looked into the question of airport stations. And here are the results that we found. These are from the NOAA data record. This is the number of stations. You see them dropping rapidly here, starting around 19, in this case, 90. And these are the number of airport stations which do not drop rapidly. And then we thought we'd look at one particular continent. So we looked at Africa. In Africa, the same thing happened. The number of stations dropped precipitously in the early 90s, but the number of airport stations also dropped, but now they become nearly 100% of all the stations in Africa. So one of the questions I would have is, do we see a pronounced warming trend in Africa? I'd like to know the answer. It's a difficult problem. We're not equipped to do provide answers to such things, but maybe others are. Okay, conclusions. We see little surface warming after 1940, contrary to IPCC, and we show the evidence for this. This removes support for IPCC claim anthropogenic warming. The reported warming is likely due to a selection of weather station data, and the suppressed hockey stick proxy data may supply key evidence we need to examine. Thank you.
I have a question. Peter Fowler wanted to say something.
Yes. Fred, I will comment only on your Arctic temperature. I am sure that there will be many people commenting on other aspects. You have shown graph that in Arctic station there is no warming after 1940. That's completely wrong. I took personally look into all existing stations in Arctic, and there is undoubtedly very significant warming from 1970 to 2010. Very significant warming. Denying that warming makes no sense. Have you said that ice core show again there is no warming in Arctic? You have an ice after 1940 or 1970. You have a whole set of ice cores in whichever you look. You have a strong warming again up to 1970, 1980 until we have an ice core. The graph which you show for ice core is probably for borehole warming, not really ice core. So I believe at least your Arctic is completely wrong.
I don't think we have any dispute at all. I know nothing about the Arctic. I didn't speak about the Arctic. The core sample Greenland. I don't remember the latitude, but it was below what it would call the Arctic, south of what it called the Arctic. What I quoted was not my own opinion. It was explicitly given by Dottie Ensign. She says there was no warming after 1940. She says that in the Science article. So that's what I quoted. But this is only one example of a proxy, and of course we need many more. And obviously they won't all agree with each other.
I'm Larry Binswood from the University of Alaska. So when you said that there was no correlation between the satellite observations and surface stations, I just checked the NASA Earth Observatory webpage, and it leads off, do satellite observations of atmospheric temperatures agree with surface-based observations and model predictions? And the answer is yes. And I won't go through everything, but their last conclusion is, for recent decades, all current atmospheric data sets now show global average warming that is similar to surface warming.
I'm just translating, I didn't get it all. But it says he's reading a NASA summary that all surface and atmospheric measurements are not consistent.
I agree.
How do you respond to that?
I agree.
No, they are consistent. The what?
Are now consistent.
I disagree.
I'll read it again. So this is from NASA's own webpage, from the Earth Observatory.
You want to repeat that?
Sure, I'll repeat it.
If I understand the question, he says that NASA says that the surface data and atmospheric data are consistent.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what
They show a nice
Yeah,
graph.
Where did they say that? What year?
This is today's. I just got off their webpage today, so it's right now.
I think John Fu has something to say on this.
let's go Dick first.
Well, I'll defer.
Okay.
So the period goes from 1980 to 2010.
I just say briefly about comments on chemistry that you disagree. I think that because you disagree because the data you use is solely based on UH data sets. A lot of conclusion you quote is from the UH data set before 2005. We know actually UH data set actually have problem. When the correct the annual cycle, it's actually have a sign error. Before 2005 is totally wrong. And even now, actually, as I showed yesterday, we still have significant problem because of the impact factor it used. But when you look at another two data set, RSS and UH, as our paper 2004 already showed the atmospheric temperature trend agree with the surface temperature trend, both agree with GCM in the tropical region or more or less both adiabatic. In our 2004 paper, we will show that.
So do you agree that they're consistent or not?
Consistent.
You think they're consistent?
There's also an issue that has bothered us for a while
Consistent with what?
with each other.
With waters?
The atmospheric temperature trend is similar to surface temperature trend on the global scale. And the tropospheric temperature trend is more than surface temperature moving in the tropical region, which agree support the GCM simulation. That's the important one.
No,
Temperature certainly cannot be consistent. Are you speaking of trends or temperatures?
Temperature.
Trend.
Trend. Of course, trends.
Well, that's not what the NRC panel reports.
So that's 2000. I mean, a lot of
Oh, they've changed their
a
mind.
lot of knowledge. A lot of progress after that.
Okay. Dick, you have the last
Yeah.
one. We'll go back.
one of the early differences arose from the fact that the radio song data near the surface was compatible with the satellite data from UH. But what we had noticed was with the surface or the near surface balloon data, when you look for trends from, let's say, 1970 to the present or to They were the same. The difference arose from the fact that the balloon data showed a jump in temperature around 1976. And if you look from 1979 on, it looked like there was no trend. The question was, how is it possible for the atmosphere to go through an abrupt warming without the surface? And that brings up a very important point. It is possible because it could be regional, and by the time it was smoothed over the whole globe, there could actually be several years delay. Because when we think of global mean temperature, we're thinking of one dimension. I keep making this point, the system is not one dimension.